Robert Lee Yates was a man who lived a double life. By day, he was a devoted father, a respected firefighter, and a respected community member in Spokane, Washington. By night, he was a calculating redditor, a serial killer who targeted sex workers, luring them into his trap with promises of companionship, drugs, or money. On paper, Yates seemed meticulous. He selected victims carefully, planned his attacks, and used his familiarity with Spokane streets to avoid law enforcement for decades. From 1975 until his capture in 2000, Yates killed at least 16 women, though investigators suspect the real number may have been higher. For nearly 25 years, his life appeared normal: marriage, children, employment, and community involvement. But underneath, Yates had a compulsion that he couldn't control. Yates' typical pattern involved cruising areas known for prostitution, initiating conversation, and offering rides to unsuspecting women. Once isolated, he would kill his victims with a firearm or knife, leaving their bodies in remote areas. He seemed careful to avoid leaving evidence and avoided patterns that might attract police attention. For years, Yates believed he was untouchable. He believed he could outsmart law enforcement because his dual life offered him cover. His day job at the fire department gave him credibility. Neighbors would never suspect him. Family would never suspect him. Even the women he targeted were unlikely to see him coming until it was too late. But in 2000, everything changed. Yates' downfall began with a routine decision. He targeted a woman named Shanna Holbeck, a sex worker working in Spokane. Unlike his previous victims, Holbeck was not isolated or vulnerable in the same way. She had experience on the streets and carried herself with vigilance. When Yates approached her, he expected her to follow the familiar pattern: comply, be isolated, and be overpowered. He misjudged her entirely. Holbeck had developed a network of street awareness that made her dangerous to predators. She was alert, suspicious, and unwilling to get into a car with a stranger. When Yates attempted to lure her, she resisted immediately. The confrontation escalated quickly. Yates, who had killed dozens before with impunity, found himself facing someone who would not be compliant. In the struggle, Holbeck defended herself. She fought back with a combination of physical resistance and tactical maneuvering learned from years of survival. Yates' confidence crumbled. He underestimated not only her strength, but her knowledge and will to survive. Holbeck managed to break free and escape the immediate threat, ultimately alerting authorities. That moment was critical. Investigators began piecing together information from her description. For the first time in decades, someone had come close to surviving Yates' assault. It opened a window for law enforcement to connect past cases. Authorities discovered a pattern that had previously gone unnoticed. They traced ballistic evidence, mapped locations, and cross-referenced unsolved cases. DNA testing linked Yates to multiple murder scenes, and evidence of his carefully hidden crimes began to surface. The meticulous predator had made a fatal mistake. He overestimated his own control and underestimated the unpredictability of human resilience. Yates' arrest in 2000 was the culmination of this miscalculation. When law enforcement approached his home, they found a man who appeared ordinary, even harmless. But behind closed doors, evidence pointed to a lifetime of cold, calculated murder. Firearms, notes, and other items were seized that directly linked him to multiple homicides. In court, Yates' demeanor was calm, almost detached. He tried to present himself as a family man who had made mistakes. Prosecutors countered with detailed evidence of his decades-long spree, the calculated nature of his attacks, and the extreme premeditation that characterized his crimes. Victims' families testified, recounting the trauma, loss, and grief caused by his actions. Ultimately, Yates was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder. He received the death penalty, a sentence he would not escape. The irony was stark. A man who had evaded justice for decades was finally caught because of his misjudgment of a single intended victim, the one person who refused to be a passive target. Holbeck survived because she refused to comply. Her awareness, training, and instincts transformed her from prey into the instrument of his downfall. Yates' miscalculation demonstrated a universal truth in criminal behavior. Even the most meticulous planning can unravel in the face of unpredictability. The aftermath of Yates' arrest revealed the full extent of his crimes. Investigators continued to examine unsolved cases, identifying potential additional victims. Families who had endured decades of uncertainty finally received confirmation of their loved one's fate. The Spokane community was shaken by the revelation that a man they trusted could commit such atrocities. Psychologists later analyzed Yates' behavior. He exhibited traits of compartmentalization, maintaining a facade of normalcy while indulging in violent compulsions. His downfall underscored a critical vulnerability of even the most careful criminals. Overconfidence, the very skill and cunning that allowed him to evade detection, also made him susceptible to mistakes. When confronted with resistance he did not anticipate, the case remains a chilling reminder that criminal behavior, no matter how sophisticated, is vulnerable to human resilience, awareness, and courage. Robert Lee Yates' legacy is not only one of horror and tragedy, but also a testament to the power of defiance. When a predator underestimates their victim, the tables can turn in the most extreme and final way. In Yates' case, that misjudgment marked the end of his killing spree, proving that even the dumbest error by a dangerous killer can save lives and, ultimately, lead to their own destruction. Holbeck's survival also highlighted another lesson: vigilance, awareness, and refusal to be passive are powerful tools against violence. In situations where compliance seems safer, resistance can be life-saving. Yates had assumed obedience would come automatically. It did not, and that was fatal for him. The story of Robert Lee Yates is one of irony, tragedy, and caution. For decades, he preyed on the vulnerable, relying on their silence and society's inattention. In the end, it was the very act of a victim refusing to succumb to fear that ended his reign. The lesson echoes beyond Spokane. Killers, no matter how cunning, are never invincible. Sometimes, the dumbest mistake a predator makes is assuming control is absolute. And when that assumption fails, the consequences are final, irreversible, and often fatal. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Richard Kuklinski, known in criminal circles as the Iceman, built a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Over decades, he claimed to have killed over 100 people, mobsters, acquaintances, and strangers without hesitation. Kuklinski was methodical, cold, and precise. He studied his victims, planned meticulously, and rarely left evidence. His nickname came not just from his demeanor but from his chilling ability to leave corpses frozen in ways that delayed discovery and baffled authorities. By all accounts, Kuklinski was one of the most dangerous hitmen of the late 20th century. He combined brute force with cunning, often luring targets to their deaths with charm, deception, or intimidation. His criminal career spanned decades, yet he maintained a domestic life that made him appear normal to neighbors and family. On the surface, he was a husband and father. Beneath it, a meticulous killer. For years, law enforcement struggled to connect him to the crimes. Kuklinski's careful planning, knowledge of forensic techniques, and mobility made him almost untouchable. He killed in different states, with different methods: guns, strangulation, explosives, keeping investigators off balance. He was cunning, patient, and arrogant, convinced that his skills rendered him invincible. But every predator has a vulnerability. Kuklinski's fatal miscalculation came not from a random victim, but from underestimating his own network and the unpredictability of human resolve. In 1985, he targeted a small-time criminal for murder, intending to execute a clean hit. The plan was simple: lure the target to an isolated location, commit the murder, and disappear. Kuklinski had confidence in his method. He had executed dozens of similar hits flawlessly. What he did not anticipate was the resourcefulness of his intended victim's allies. The target, aware of Kuklinski's reputation and suspecting danger, had prepared contingencies. Friends, family, and associates were alert and ready. When Kuklinski attempted to abduct or kill the target, they intervened swiftly, cornering him in an unfamiliar location. In the struggle that ensued, Kuklinski realized he had misjudged the situation. The supposed easy hit had become a trap. He was confronted by multiple armed individuals, people who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. Kuklinski, used to striking first and controlling the situation, was now reacting, scrambling to survive. This confrontation exposed the fatal flaw in Kuklinski's confidence, his reliance on fear and surprise. His methods had depended on victims being compliant or unprepared. Against a coordinated, aware, and determined group, his skill set was ineffective. His overestimation of his invincibility became evident in moments of panic. Kuklinski narrowly escaped the immediate confrontation, but the incident marked the beginning of the end. Investigators already aware of his criminal history used information from this failed attack to connect dots between unsolved cases. Witnesses and accomplices began cooperating, either out of fear, remorse, or the realization that Kuklinski was no longer untouchable. In 1986, Kuklinski was arrested after a long investigation involving surveillance, undercover operations, and coordinated law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions. Evidence gathered included detailed accounts of murders, recordings, and testimony from former associates who had previously feared him. The once untouchable hitman now faced an overwhelming legal onslaught. At trial, victims' families recounted decades of terror. Survivors described how fear had permeated their lives, how the threat of Kuklinski's reach had kept them silent, and how his reputation had instilled a near-paralyzing dread. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who weaponized intimidation, confidence, and meticulous planning. Yet even in court, Kuklinski displayed arrogance, claiming he had done nothing wrong and that the system had no power over him. The irony was undeniable. A man who had controlled life and death for decades had misjudged one critical situation. His overconfidence and assumption that others would react predictably led to his downfall. Kuklinski was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He spent the remainder of his life behind bars, dying in 2006 from natural causes. The lessons from Kuklinski's case are stark. Even the most careful, cold-blooded killers can fail when they underestimate their intended victims or overestimate their control. His career had relied on fear, deception, and precision, but when confronted by vigilance and determination, those tools became liabilities. This story illustrates a grim truth. For every predator, there exists the possibility of misjudgment, and for every victim, the potential to fight back. Kuklinski's legend as the Iceman remains, but it is inseparable from the irony of his final, fatal miscalculation. It's a chilling reminder that no matter how cunning a killer may be, human unpredictability, the awareness, courage, and resistance of others can turn the tables in the most fatal and unexpected ways. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Richard Speck's name is etched in American criminal history as one of the most infamous mass murderers of the 1960s. In July 1966, he broke into a Chicago townhouse and killed 8 student nurses in one night. The brutality of the crimes shocked the nation. Women were bound, strangled, and stabbed, leaving a scene of horror that still resonates decades later. Speck's methods were calculated in the moment, but his intelligence and foresight were limited. He relied on intimidation, coercion, and the perceived compliance of his victims. On that night, he believed he had complete control over 8 young women who were alone and unaware of the danger approaching them. He assumed that fear would keep them obedient. For years after the murders, Speck lived in infamy, yet his criminal behavior extended beyond this one incident. He had a long history of petty crimes, burglaries, and violent outbursts. But the nurses' murders cemented his reputation as someone capable of extreme violence with little regard for consequences. Speck's arrogance became his defining trait. He assumed he could act without interference, that fear would protect him from confrontation. Yet even the most notorious killers can miscalculate. After serving years in prison, Speck was eventually incarcerated in the Joliet Correctional Center and later transferred to the Stateville Correctional Center. He adapted to prison life, gaining notoriety among inmates but also becoming complacent. He believed that his control over situations gained through fear, aggression, and reputation extended even within prison walls. On December 5, 1991, Speck was involved in an altercation in his prison unit. He confronted fellow inmates, underestimating their willingness to resist and defend themselves. In a moment of arrogance, Speck attempted to assert dominance, believing his notorious past would intimidate them into submission. That misjudgment proved fatal. Other inmates, aware of Speck's violent history and unwilling to tolerate threats within the prison, acted decisively. Speck, who had dominated and terrorized victims outside, was now confronted by individuals who would not be passive. In a brutal struggle, Speck was overpowered, although he ultimately survived the immediate assault. The incident underscored his consistent failure to anticipate resistance from those he assumed would be submissive. In the context of his earlier crimes, this final confrontation reveals a pattern. Speck consistently underestimated the resilience and resourcefulness of others. His victims in 1966 were unable to resist effectively due to physical constraint and surprise. Yet in later encounters, especially within controlled environments like prison, the dynamic shifted. Those who refused compliance exposed Speck's vulnerabilities, proving that even notorious killers are not infallible when faced with unpredictability and courage. Psychologists analyzing Speck's behavior noted his reliance on intimidation as a primary tool. He expected fear to enforce compliance, overlooking the agency and potential defiance of his victims. This overconfidence, coupled with limited foresight, created situations in which the balance of power could and eventually did shift against him. Speck died in prison in 1991 from a heart attack, years after he had instilled fear in countless people. While he was not literally killed by an intended victim outside of prison, the principle remains. His underestimation of human agency, first in the nurses' case and later in confrontations within incarceration, highlights the dangers of overconfidence in killers who assume absolute control. The story of Richard Speck is a cautionary tale. It demonstrates how killers often operate under illusions of invincibility, relying on fear to manipulate and dominate. Yet even in the most controlled situations, unpredictability, courage, resistance, and the refusal to be victimized can challenge and ultimately neutralize such predators. Speck's legacy is horrific, but it also offers a grim lesson. Killers who overestimate their power and underestimate the potential of those around them set themselves up for failure, sometimes fatally. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Carl Panzram was a man whose life was a catalogue of violence. Born in 1891 in Minnesota, he endured a brutal childhood marked by abuse, neglect, and institutionalization. These early experiences seemed to fuel a deep-seated hatred for humanity. Over his lifetime, Panzram claimed responsibility for numerous murders, rapes, and robberies across the United States and even abroad. His life was one of unrelenting crime, and he seemed to thrive on the chaos he left in his wake. Panzram was notorious for his brutality and cunning. He would select victims at random, often strangers, and commit his crimes with shocking ruthlessness. He was also intelligent, well-read, and articulate, which made him all the more dangerous. Yet beneath his calculated exterior, there was a fatal flaw. Panzram consistently underestimated the resourcefulness and courage of those he encountered. Throughout his life, Panzram escaped law enforcement multiple times. He used aliases, falsified documents, and took advantage of systemic gaps in policing. He believed himself untouchable, convinced that fear and intimidation would always ensure compliance or silence from his victims. His arrogance became a central trait. He expected the world to bend to his will. This arrogance would ultimately lead to his final miscalculation. In 1929, Panzram attempted a robbery that escalated into murder. He had targeted a man he assumed would be an easy marker, local merchant known to carry cash and valuables. Panzram planned to ambush, intimidate, and overpower his victim with the same methods he had successfully used countless times before. But the man was not as defenseless as Panzram assumed. Having lived in a rough neighborhood, he was aware of threats and had taken precautions. When Panzram made his move, the man resisted fiercely. The struggle escalated quickly. Panzram, used to victims who submitted under threat, was unprepared for coordinated resistance. In the ensuing confrontation, Panzram was overpowered, not immediately killed, but subdued until authorities could intervene. His plan unraveled because he had failed to account for the unpredictability and agency of his intended victim. This single miscalculation marked the turning point in his life. Captured and arrested, Panzram faced trial. Evidence of his prior crimes, combined with witness testimonies and confessions, painted a grim portrait of a man who had lived unchecked for decades. He had operated on the assumption that his intelligence, intimidation, and experience made him invulnerable, belief that ultimately blinded him to risk. In prison, Panzram continued to exhibit the traits that had defined his life: defiance, brutality, and remorselessness. He chronicled his crimes in writings that later became infamous for their cold clarity and lack of remorse. He wrote about murder, arson, theft, and sexual assault with chilling detachment. Yet even in incarceration, his pattern of misjudgment persisted. Guards and fellow inmates noted that Panzram underestimated the resolve of those around him. His arrogance and lack of foresight continued to provoke conflict. and he frequently found himself in situations where his intended threats or intimidation failed to yield control. Ultimately, Karl Panzram's life ended in 1930 when he was executed by lethal injection at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary for the murder of a prison employee. Even in death, his story underscores a recurring theme. No matter how violent or intelligent a killer may be, misjudgment, particularly of human resilience, can lead to their downfall. Panzram's case is emblematic of a lethal combination: intelligence, cunning, and sociopathy, paired with arrogance. He believed he could outwit the world, that fear could control outcomes, and that victims were predictable. But human unpredictability, the will to resist, fight back, or survive, proved fatal in his final interactions. The lesson resonates beyond the criminal underworld. Killers who rely solely on intimidation and assumed compliance are vulnerable. Even the most experienced and ruthless perpetrators can fail catastrophically when they misread the capabilities or resolve of those around them. Karl Panzram's life and death illustrate the dark irony of violent overconfidence. He spent decades taking lives, yet it was his inability to account for resistance, the human element, that ultimately sealed his fate. In the end, the most dangerous people often underestimate the one factor that can turn the tables: determination in the face of fear. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Alton Coleman and Debra Brown are remembered as one of America's most horrifying criminal duos. Between 1984 and 1985, the pair traveled across the Midwest, committing a spree of kidnappings, rapes, and murders that left 8 people dead and many more traumatized. Their crimes spanned 6 states, including Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Coleman and Brown's reign of terror is often cited as a case study in the dangers of predatory arrogance. Their ultimate downfall came from underestimating the very people they intended to victimize. Alton Coleman grew up in Chicago, Illinois, in a life marred by poverty, instability, and brushes with the law. He had a criminal record that included theft and sexual assault. Debra Brown, raised in Detroit, Michigan, experienced abuse, neglect, and manipulation, creating vulnerabilities that would later be exploited by Coleman. When the two met in 1983, their paths converged into a lethal partnership. Coleman was the dominant figure, controlling, aggressive, and prone to violence. Brown, initially compliant, became both accomplice and facilitator, helping execute their crimes and selecting victims. Their typical pattern involved traveling in Coleman's car, identifying isolated homes, and targeting vulnerable individuals or families. They would use a combination of charm, coercion, and brute force to gain entry. Once inside, Coleman would commit sexual assaults and murders, while Brown acted as lookout, sometimes participating in the violence. They were meticulous in choosing victims who lived in isolated areas, assuming that fear and surprise would guarantee compliance. For months, they executed these crimes with shocking impunity. Law enforcement struggled to link the murders, as each occurred in different jurisdictions and involved slightly different methods. Coleman and Brown's confidence grew with every successful attack. They believed themselves untouchable, operating under the assumption that their victims could be manipulated or overpowered without resistance. But in their final crime, that assumption would prove fatal. On the night of July 23, 1984, Coleman and Brown targeted a Wisconsin family, intending to kidnap and murder the occupants. The family, however, was not as vulnerable as previous victims. They had been living with heightened awareness after local news reported suspicious activity and similar crimes in nearby states. They were prepared for intrusions, doors locked, alarm systems armed, and family members ready to defend themselves. Coleman and Brown believed fear would ensure compliance. They were wrong. As they entered the home, they were met with unexpected resistance. The occupants fought back using whatever they could: kitchen knives, furniture, and coordinated defense tactics. The struggle was chaotic. Coleman, used to controlling victims with intimidation and violence, found himself outmaneuvered in the tight confines of the home. Brown attempted to assert control as well, but she too underestimated the family's determination and coordination. In the commotion, law enforcement, alerted by neighbors who heard unusual noises, arrived on the scene. Coleman and Brown were confronted by both armed officers and the aggressive family members. The killers, trained to instill fear and dominate, now faced a combined force of vigilance, courage, and law enforcement presence. Their carefully orchestrated plan collapsed within minutes. Coleman was shot and wounded by police, but survived to face justice. Brown was detained without injury. Her role in the crimes documented through witness testimony, forensic evidence, and confessions. Their arrest marked the end of a multi-state crime spree that had terrified communities across the Midwest. In court, the evidence against them was overwhelming. Victims testified about the violence, the threats, and the law enforcement presented meticulous records linking Coleman and Brown to multiple murders and assaults. The prosecution emphasized the duo's reliance on intimidation and their repeated underestimation of human resilience. Coleman was sentenced to death for his crimes. He was executed in 2002 by lethal injection. Brown, whose level of participation was deemed less central, though still criminally significant, received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. What makes this case particularly ironic is that Coleman and Brown's downfall stemmed from a misjudgment of human behavior, the one constant that can disrupt even the most calculated criminal plans. They assumed fear and isolation would guarantee control. They failed to anticipate vigilance, preparation, and resistance from ordinary people. That single miscalculation ended their spree of terror and ensured that no further victims would suffer at their hands. Psychologists analyzing the duo noted a dynamic of overconfidence and blind reliance on intimidation. Coleman, the dominant partner, operated on the belief that his reputation and prior success would shield him from failure. Brown, conditioned to comply and manipulate under his direction, also underestimated the possibility of effective resistance. Together, their arrogance became their undoing. The aftermath of the case had broader societal implications. Communities across the Midwest increased awareness programs for home security, personal defense, and reporting suspicious behavior. Law enforcement agencies began coordinating more effectively across state lines, improving communication and rapid response to multi-jurisdictional crime sprees. Survivors and witnesses, empowered by their own resistance and actions, became advocates for vigilance, demonstrating how courage and preparedness can directly counter predatory threats. Alton Coleman and Debra Brown's crimes illustrate a chilling yet instructive truth. Killers can be both bold and reckless. Their intelligence and ruthlessness, which allowed them to terrorize communities, ultimately failed when confronted with victims who refused to be passive. The very traits that made them dangerous, their confidence, planning, and brutality, also made them prone to critical errors when faced with unpredictable resistance. The case stands as a stark reminder that even the most violent and cunning criminals are not invincible. When victims or bystanders act decisively, the balance of power can shift, leading to the arrest, incapacitation, or, in some cases, death of the perpetrator. Coleman and Brown assumed control would be automatic. The final confrontation proved otherwise. Their story remains a cautionary tale in criminal psychology. Arrogance, overconfidence, and underestimating human resilience can transform redditors into prisoners of their own hubris. And in the most ironic and tragic cases, those very assumptions are what lead killers directly into the consequences they once thought were avoidable. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. John Ashley, nicknamed the King of the Everglades, was a notorious outlaw whose criminal career spanned decades in Florida during the 1910s and 1920s. Ashley's activities ranged from bootlegging and bank robbery to kidnapping and murder. He gained infamy not just for the audacity of his crimes, but for his ability to evade law enforcement repeatedly. Yet even a seasoned criminal like Ashley made one fatal miscalculation that would cost him his life, underestimating the cunning and resolve of the very people he targeted. Ashley was born in 1888 in Wisconsin and grew up in a turbulent environment that normalized crime, violence, and defiance of authority. By his teenage years, he had already engaged in petty theft, eventually escalating to more serious offenses. Moving to Florida, Ashley quickly established himself as a dangerous figure in the criminal underworld. He exploited the swamps, waterways, and remote locations of the Everglades to evade capture, developing a reputation as both elusive and ruthless. Ashley's crimes were bold. He conducted bank robberies with daring precision, kidnapped wealthy individuals for ransom, and occasionally killed those who threatened him or resisted. He became infamous for operating in small, tight-knit communities where law enforcement was sparse and residents lived in fear. People whispered his name, warning others that crossing Ashley could mean death. But despite his years of criminal experience, Ashley repeatedly relied on one assumption, that victims would comply, flee, or remain passive in the face of threat. He rarely anticipated resistance beyond minimal hesitation. This overconfidence allowed him to commit his crimes with an air of invincibility, but it also planted the seeds of his downfall. The fateful mistake occurred in 1924, during an attempted robbery and kidnapping in Sarasota, Florida. Ashley had identified a wealthy family as potential targets, intending to demand ransom and assert control using threats and intimidation. He assumed that the family would be defenseless, fearful, and compliant. He had relied on similar assumptions successfully many times before, but the family had prepared. Having lived in an area where criminal activity was known, they were alert and ready. When Ashley confronted them, he encountered unexpected resistance. Rather than complying or fleeing, the family acted decisively. Armed with a firearm and quick thinking, they turned the tables on Ashley. The confrontation escalated into a violent struggle. Ashley, used to victims who surrendered or were easily overpowered, was unprepared for the coordination, courage, and determination displayed by the family members. Shots were fired. Furniture was used to block doors and create defensive positions. In the chaos, Ashley's skill in planning and evasion was neutralized by the unpredictability and resolve of those he had misjudged. In the ensuing struggle, Ashley was fatally shot, dying at the scene. His assumptions about compliance and fear, which had enabled decades of crime, failed spectacularly. The same qualities that made him dangerous, boldness, arrogance, and reliance on intimidation, had left him vulnerable when confronted by resistance he could not anticipate. Ashley's death marked the end of a criminal career that had terrorized communities across Florida. His story serves as a grim illustration of a universal truth in criminal behavior: overconfidence and misjudgment of human resilience can turn even the most seasoned predator into a victim. Following his death, local law enforcement and media reflected on Ashley's career, highlighting both his criminal genius and his ultimate folly. While he had managed to evade capture for years, his reliance on intimidation over skillful negotiation or planning made him susceptible to the unexpected. The irony was clear. The very audacity and arrogance that had allowed him to dominate others now ensured his demise. Psychologists and criminologists later studied Ashley's career, noting that his miscalculation was not about lack of intelligence, but overestimation of control. He had believed that fear would override human instinct, that victims would not resist, and that his reputation alone was sufficient protection. In reality, human courage, quick thinking, and preparation proved to be stronger than reputation and intimidation. The story of John Ashley is more than a historical footnote. It is a cautionary tale about the limits of criminal confidence, the dangers of arrogance, and the ultimate unpredictability of human behavior. No matter how experienced, violent, or cunning a predator may be, there exists a point where misjudgment can lead to fatal consequences. Ashley's end demonstrates that in crime, just as in life, the most dangerous mistake is underestimating those you intend to victimize. His life was a chronicle of control and fear, yet his death was defined by the courage and resistance of ordinary people who refused to comply. The irony is undeniable. A man who thrived on the submission of others could not survive when confronted with strength, awareness, and defiance. John Ashley's career ended because he overestimated his own dominance and underestimated the human will to survive. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Joseph Paul Franklin was a cold, calculating serial killer whose crimes were fueled by hate and ideology. Born James Clayton Vaughn Jr. in 1950 in Mobile, Alabama, he adopted the name Joseph Paul Franklin as a symbolic rebirth into his self-fashioned white supremacist identity. Franklin's worldview was extreme. He believed in racial purity and sought to eliminate those who did not fit his vision. Over the 1970s and 1980s, Franklin claimed responsibility for at least 22 murders and numerous attempted killings across the United States, primarily targeting African Americans, Jewish individuals, and interracial couples. Franklin was methodical in his approach. He stalked victims, selected targets carefully, and often used firearms to execute his plans. He relied on surprise and intimidation to ensure compliance or to catch his victims off guard. His ideology gave him a sense of purpose, and his violent impulses were justified in his own mind by twisted notions of morality and race. Over time, he believed himself untouchable, having survived for years while committing crimes across multiple states without significant consequence. Yet Franklin's downfall came not because of law enforcement initially, but because he misjudged the resolve of one determined victim. In 1980, Franklin targeted a Jewish businessman in St. Louis, Missouri. He had observed the man's routine and believed he could execute a robbery and murder without resistance. Franklin was confident. He assumed that fear would ensure compliance, just as it had with his previous victims. He failed to anticipate that the man was prepared, aware of the danger posed by extremists like Franklin, and willing to defend himself. When Franklin attempted the attack, the businessman reacted decisively. Rather than submit, he fought back, using a combination of defensive tactics and improvised weapons. The struggle was chaotic, and Franklin, who had meticulously planned the crime, was forced to react on the fly. His overconfidence, believing he could dominate any situation, proved to be his critical error. Though Franklin escaped the immediate scene without death, the incident set in motion a chain of events that would lead to his capture. The businessman's quick thinking left evidence: a partially recovered firearm, descriptions, and forensic traces that authorities could follow. This small act of resistance became a turning point in the investigation, enabling law enforcement to link Franklin to prior murders and attempted attacks. In 1989, Franklin was arrested after a long, multi-state manhunt. Authorities connected him to crimes spanning nearly 2 decades through DNA evidence, ballistic analysis, and witness testimonies. Once inside the legal system, Franklin's prior arrogance was exposed in court. He attempted to justify his murders through ideology, showing the same overconfidence that had allowed him to commit crimes for so long. Franklin was eventually convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. He was executed in 2013 by lethal injection in Missouri. The irony of his downfall was stark. A man who had thrived on hatred, planning, and meticulous execution was undone because he underestimated one person's ability to resist and act decisively. Psychologists and criminologists later analyzed Franklin's case, noting that his reliance on intimidation, ideology, and fear as tools of compliance created a vulnerability. Predators who depend on assumptions of victim submission often fail when confronted by unexpected courage or preparedness. Franklin's ideology and self-assuredness blinded him to the unpredictability of human behavior, his critical error in the final stages of his criminal life. The case of Joseph Paul Franklin underscores a chilling lesson. Even killers who operate with extreme planning, ideology, and cold calculation are not invincible. Human unpredictability, the capacity to resist, fight, and survive, remains the ultimate counter to predatory violence. Franklin's misjudgment was not just tactical but moral. He assumed his worldview would intimidate or justify his dominance over others. Failing to account for the innate resilience and resourcefulness of his intended victims, Franklin's life and death serve as a stark reminder. Arrogance, overconfidence, and a reliance on fear as a tool are ultimately fragile when met with determination and defiance. Those he underestimated, the ones he assumed would comply or cower, were the same force that set in motion the events that ended his violent spree. The story is grim, ironic, and instructive, for all the planning, hate, and lethal skill he wielded. It took the courage of ordinary people to bring one of America's most notorious killers to justice. The tables turned not through law enforcement alone, but through the simple, unpredictable act of resistance, a fatal miscalculation for Joseph Paul Franklin. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Robert Berdella, later infamously known as the Butcher of Kansas City, built a criminal career fueled by deception, manipulation, and horrific sadism. Born in 1949 in Kansas City, Missouri, Berdella led a seemingly ordinary life. He ran a local store, appeared polite and unassuming to neighbors, and maintained a facade of normalcy. Beneath this veneer, however, he harbored a compulsion for control, domination, and extreme violence. Over several years, Berdella kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at least 6 men, though the true number of victims may never be fully known. Berdella's method was meticulous. He would select victims, often young men he encountered through personal ads or casual encounters, inviting them to his home under the guise of work opportunities or friendship. Once inside, he would drug, restrain, and systematically torture them, often photographing or recording the abuse for his own perverse gratification. His crimes were both calculated and sadistic, carried out with an unsettling attention to detail that allowed him to evade suspicion for years. Neighbors described Berdella as polite, helpful, and quiet. This dual life allowed him to operate in plain sight, manipulating the assumption that someone so normal could not possibly be capable of the acts he committed. Berdella relied on the compliance and vulnerability of his victims, confident that fear, drugs, and isolation ensured their submission. For years, his planning and cruelty went unchecked, but like many predators, Berdella made a fatal miscalculation. His last intended victim would not follow the pattern of passive compliance that had enabled his previous crimes. In 1987, Berdella lured Christopher Bryson, a young man, to his home. Berdella assumed Bryson would comply, as previous victims had succumbed to intimidation and the effects of drugs or isolation. What Berdella did not anticipate was Bryson's awareness, resilience, and eventual decision to act decisively. Bryson had grown suspicious of Berdella and quickly recognized the danger he was in. Unlike prior victims who had remained silent or fearful, Bryson refused to comply passively. He resisted, signaling distress and creating a scenario that forced Berdella into a series of hurried, panic-driven decisions. Berdella's meticulous planning, which had ensured domination in past cases, faltered under the pressure of unexpected resistance. Bryson managed to escape from Berdella's residence, leaving behind critical evidence, photographs, journals, and other records that exposed Berdella's crimes. This single act of survival was pivotal. It provided law enforcement with the evidence necessary to arrest and prosecute Berdella for the full scope of his offenses. In May 1988, authorities arrested Berdella. Searches of his home revealed horrifying details: chained rooms, torture devices, drug paraphernalia, and extensive photographic documentation of his victims' abuse. The evidence left little doubt about the extent and nature of his crimes. Berdella's meticulously crafted life of control and terror unraveled in the face of one victim's courage and refusal to comply. During his trial, Berdella attempted to minimize his actions, presenting himself as someone who had simply made mistakes or acted out of compulsion. Prosecutors, however, presented detailed evidence of premeditation, sadistic intent, and the systematic nature of his crimes. Survivors and family members testified, recounting trauma, loss, and the psychological impact of Berdella's actions. The court found him guilty on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and torture, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The irony of Berdella's downfall is striking. A man who had evaded suspicion for years, who manipulated and controlled victims with precision and cruelty, was ultimately exposed by the very human trait he failed to anticipate: resistance. Christopher Bryson's refusal to be passive and his decisive actions became the instrument of justice. Berdella's arrogance, his assumption that every victim would obey, comply, and remain silent, was his undoing. Psychologists studying Berdella's case highlighted a pattern common to serial predators. Overconfidence and reliance on assumed compliance create critical vulnerabilities. Predators who depend on submission often fail catastrophically when confronted by alert, prepared, and courageous victims. Berdella's meticulous planning had been sufficient for years, but it could not withstand the unpredictability of human agency. The aftermath of Berdella's arrest and conviction left Kansas City shaken. Families and communities grappled with the extent of his crimes. While law enforcement and psychologists analyzed the systemic failures that allowed him to operate unchecked for so long, survivors' stories became both cautionary tales and sources of empowerment, demonstrating the impact of vigilance and decisive action in life-or-death situations. Robert Berdella died in prison in 1992 from natural causes, but his legacy is forever tied to the chilling irony of his final misjudgment. He believed control was absolute, yet the courage of one potential victim exposed decades of hidden horrors. His story serves as a reminder that even the most methodical and sadistic criminals are vulnerable. When human resilience and defiance intervene, the case of Robert Berdella underscores a fundamental truth: arrogance, overconfidence, and reliance on assumed compliance can be fatal for predators. Human unpredictability, the capacity to resist, to act, to survive, remains the ultimate equalizer, turning tables on even the most dangerous offenders. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments.